My second favorite villain of all time is one Eric Killmonger, played by Michael B. Jordan in the film Black Panther, directed by possibly soon to be known as the greatest black filmmaker of all time, Ryan Coogler. That may seem early since he's only made 5 movies, but like, has anyone started out with 5 movies as good as he has? Every single one of them, in fact, starring Michael B. Jordan. Well, not every one of them starring Michael B. Jordan, but at least featuring him. Only one he wasn't the lead star in. Michael B. Jordan, I never really think of as a great actor, but when I think about him in Ryan Coogler movies like Black Panther and Fruitvale Station and the recently released Sinners, I don't know. I have to rethink that take. That's how good Coogler is. There's some special stuff done by Coogler with Killmonger in this movie, so special that he is probably the most iconic and memorable and influential character from that movie, and not the actual hero that the movie's named after, Black Panther, played by the late Chadwick Boseman. It's Killmonger and not T'Challa that is a magnet for conversation and controversy. In fact, while the movie does a lot to make us hate Killmonger, I'm sure I speak for a lot of black people when I say I don't hate him, at least not as much as I should, right? This is the thing about villains in any story, whether it be TV, film, video games, whatever. A good villain is not just a good part of a good story. They're really key to how those stories can transcend into greater, more meaningful things in discourse. Because of good villains, we're often able to do and say so much about the stories we love. And in turn, those stories say a lot about us, or in my case, give us a lot that we want to say. And all of that is very important for black villains, which is kind of sad because I don't know if black villains get enough love for how many of them are able to do a lot by playing the villain role and playing it well. White people have always been allowed to be villainous in media in ways that black villains sometimes dream about. When we think of iconic white villains, we're usually thinking about the Joker or Hannibal Lecter, Pennywise, Cersei Lannister, Dio. These are all villainous, often outright evil characters that we love seeing on our screens or within our pages. And in my mind, there's plenty of black villains that are just as interesting and significant to storytelling, or if they actually aren't interesting or significant, the reason why they aren't is still pretty interesting and gives me a lot of things I want to talk about. Thus, the 10,000 word essay that I'm reading off the teleprompter right now. What I'm going to do with this topic is explore and kind of dig into what's going on with black villains and what these characters may tell us about the black experience and black art. Before I start, be forewarned for those who care about spoilers for numerous movies and TV shows, most of them very, very old, even some of them before my childhood. Here's your warning for spoilers in the form of a list, or maybe it's right here. I'll try to avoid spoilers mostly, but I can't make any promises because this is the Black Media Breakdown.
Dragmatic.
Am I the baddest mofo low down around this town? I can't hear you.
You're incapable of running this shit. Sit your $5 ass down before I make change.
Part 1, villains we love. Let's lay some groundwork real quick, as any video essay over an hour should. Let's talk about Dr. Facilier, one of the more iconic, newer black villains in the game right now. Facilier is your typical villain in that he's a bad guy, i.e. unlike some of the other villains we'll talk about, there's not a ton of complexity to him. He has a simple motivation. He wants to rule New Orleans, and he wants to save himself from debt he's gotten into with his friends from the other side. So he has some flair, he has some voodoo and dark magic and mischief that he all uses to try to address his needs. What makes him good is that he's just really good doing this thing in the story. He has an amazing look, he's excellently animated, he probably has the best song from that movie, and he's voiced by the iconic Keith David. Dr. Facilier is clean, straightforward, and simple, but not where I want to go with most of the video, at least not yet. Because so many other villains, especially black villains, are not so straightforward. In fact, the way their villain role plays out often complicates our feelings toward them as the audience. Oftentimes, black villains or even villains of a story can be the protagonist as well, and the antagonist can be on the side of right. For example, Lupita Nyong'o's tethered character Red in the movie Us is legitimately fighting to get her life back and low-key leading like a revolution of oppressed people. But the movie doesn't take her side. The original bad thing that happens in the movie, spoiler alert number 1, is what the antagonist does to Red's character way back in time before the movie actually starts. And this also shows how some protagonists are bad guys themselves and have villainous traits in their own right. In a lot of cinema, especially American cinema, there's a deification of the outlaw. It's intrinsically tied to the American myth, and Black people are not immune to this form of American myth spreading. In fact, we often revel in it to our own detriment. For example, take Eddie Murphy, who was probably the first Black superstar in Hollywood. He constantly played this role of the outlaw and the rule breaker, even when he was technically playing a character which represented the law, which was often in movies like 48 Hours, Metro, and of course, Beverly Hills Cop 1, 2, 3, and I think 4. We see Murphy's characters technically aligned with the law, but constantly breaking it for the sake of achieving his goals, using police tactics that would have gotten him in trouble even back in the 80s. Eddie is probably best known for playing outlaws and hustlers and shysters in movies like Trading Places, Life, and Harlem Nights. In these films, he is the protagonist and the viewer is expected to side with him, usually through showing flaws and corruptions and the mechanisms of society and legal systems. Life in particular gives us no reason not to side with Eddie and Martin Lawrence's characters, as they are clearly victims of systemic injustice, even if they are at their hearts rogues. And Eddie also helps me bring up another important distinction for Black villains and really Black characters in general. As I said earlier, Eddie was a bankable star from the late 80s into the late 90s, and that wasn't just because of Black moviegoers. He was a crossover star as well, something that isn't easy, especially if you are constantly playing Black characters. And you may be saying, well, isn't every character that Eddie Murphy plays Black? Yes, but also not in the way some of you realize. See, if you ask me, there's two very distinct genres for Black characters in most media. There are Black characters, and then there are characters who are Black. Essentially, a Black character is a character for whom their Blackness is intrinsic to their character and on some level shapes it. Maybe the story is greatly about race and thus they engage with Blackness explicitly in the story, or even if the story doesn't have a lot to say about race, the way the character acts, talks, dresses, etc. is intrinsically connected to the Black experience in some important or meaningful context for the film. Conversely, a character who just happens to be Black is the opposite. These are characters for whom their Blackness is kind of incidental and non-essential to the character. There may be some lip service to the acknowledgement that the character is Black, often in very cringe ways, but for the most part, their Blackness is not overly important to the character. A good way to differentiate is to consider how much about the character would have to change in order for the character to be race swapped. Would things about their background and motivations and other parts of their appearance make less sense or carry different meanings if the character went from Black to white or vice versa? For example, Sho'nuff in the classic B movie The Last Dragon could not be played by a non-Black actor. Now, maybe there's non-Black versions of this type of character. I mean, he's clearly based on dramatic versions of the same character from Shaw Brothers karate films from that era, but to be Sho'nuff, you gotta be Black.
Am I the meanest?
Sure enough.
Am I the prettiest?
Sure enough.
Am I the baddest mofo low down around this town?
Sure enough.
Well, who am I?
Sure enough.
Who am I?
Sure enough.
I can't hear you.
Sure enough.
Conversely, let's look at the character Simon Phoenix, played by Wesley Snipes in another classic from that era, Demolition Man. While Snipes' Black sensibilities definitely play into his performance, he's basically just the Joker. Like when we meet him for the first time, he's literally wearing clown pants and he spends half the movie laughing and dancing like you might have seen the Joker once upon a time. Thus, if you replace him with another white prominent character actor of the time, somebody like maybe Woody Harrelson, you could probably have the exact same character performance and mostly nothing would have to change. That said, it wouldn't be exactly the same because the Blackness of a character can sometimes be important on a paratextual level, aka it can impact how those characters are perceived and received by fandoms and viewers. Paratext basically means looking at how elements outside of the actual media itself impacts how it's understood and interpreted. This is important to villains because beyond what's actually in the story, the race of the character also affects how the audience responds to everything happening in the story. The most famous example of this is the character Rue from The Hunger Games. For whatever reason, a lot of white readers of that book did not know that character was black. And when the character was played by young Amandla Stenberg in the movie, there was a pretty significant, for its time at least, backlash at the idea that this white character was being replaced by a black girl. But I want to go back to this idea as to whether or not villains are actually always villainous. When I was growing up, a lot of villains were usually pretty straightforward, again, in that Dr. Facilier mode. They were bad guys, they were evil, and that was pretty much it. A villain could still be really cool, a good character with interesting elements, but it was much easier to root against them and just kind of turn your brain off in the process, waiting for the hero to defeat them. However, I read somewhere preparing for this video that a good villain needs to be the hero of their own story in order to be interesting and compelling. Even if said villain's desire come off abhorrent to us as viewers, or even in the world where the story takes place. And when we look at Dr. Facilier or Simon Phoenix or someone like Thulsa Doom, you see that in play. They may be evil, but they do have a belief system or motivation that makes sense for how they're reacting in their story. Dr. Facilier is trying to save his soul. Simon Phoenix is trying to free his own mind. And Thulsa Doom, low-key, doesn't seem to like white women. However, things are different now, and I feel like this started in the 90s. The 90s are still full of a ton of one-note schlocky villains, especially in action movies. Lots of foreign terrorists and evil wizards and whatnot. But we also begin to get villains with more complex and sympathetic motivations. For example, take the bad guy Howard Payne in the movie Speed, played by Dennis Hopper. Payne is an ex-police officer trying to get revenge on the police force for firing him without a pension for a disability he got because of his police work. In the movie The Rock, Brigadier General Francis Hummel is played by Ed Harris, and he has created a splinter cell terrorist group of ex-American soldiers who are betrayed by the American government and are trying to settle the score. This type of villain became very popular and palatable in the 90s because that's when the effects of late capitalism and neoliberalism started to be more palatable and affecting to the American people. People began to understand that the real villains were a lot of these systems failing American citizens and creating the conditions to make villains, and thus pure evildoers can't quite cut it anymore for American media consumers. And so there was a change to make villains who are right in their reasoning but wrong in their execution, which makes them more compelling but also has some problematic messaging. These types of villains are meant to relate to people's understandable dissatisfaction with the way the world is, but it also wants to promote the opinion that drastic action to address these injustices is just the wrong way to do it. So it always creates villains who take the most extreme measures possible to address legitimate social injustices so that people don't feel too comfortable with the idea that radical action might be necessary for change. And this brings us back to the first villain I really want to talk about, Eric Killmonger.
These items aren't for sale.
How do you think your ancestors got these? They paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
Is this your king? Huh? Is this your king?
Few black villains of recent memory are as iconic and controversial and probably misunderstood than Black Panther's Killmonger. His hair became a plague in video games for nearly a decade because everyone wanted a character that had the same energy he had. He's a fan favorite to the point that his cameo in the second movie made theaters erupt, even though he was there at a low point in the film. He's so beloved and compelling that there's still a ton of debate as to whether or not he's actually a bad guy at all in the movie, which the answer is yes, but I talked about this in my Black Panther video a little while back, but I'm happy that I get to revisit it because I feel like I need to clarify and explore those thoughts a bit more because I have new versions of them that I want to present to you. So first and foremost, Killmonger is a black villain in one of the blackest movies ever made by a variety of measures. Black Panther was a damn near all black production and it barely had any white actors in it, although the ones that are in there are very problematic. Again, watch the video on it from a few years ago. But despite its problems, its core themes deal with tons of concepts around the black experience, which wouldn't have been possible without their version of Killmonger. Killmonger is very much a fantasy representation of black radical resistance imagery. He's like an imaginary combination of Malcolm X, Bass Reeves, and James Bond, and he's pretty awesome. His introductory scene in the museum is iconic because it's him doing something that black people wish they could do on the regular. Tell white people the truth and get away with it. The way he looks, his hair included, is intrinsic to the sense of rebellion that he carries not just toward Wakanda, but to the world as a whole. He's dressed in a way to draw attention to the fact that he's not trying to conform as a black person. When he's accosted for looking out of place in this museum, as black people often are, even when we are dressed to conform to the environment, he engages calmly and eagerly as if the conversation is nothing special to him, versus the congenial way that black people learn to engage with white people in public as a method of protection. And then he, in the same eager and calm tone, corrects her lack of knowledge about this artifact and then adds on to it some real knowledge about the truth of the whole situation before orchestrating his heist and making out like a bandit. This is the core of Killmonger's appeal as a character and villain. He has the power, courage, skill, and expertise to pursue black liberation in a way that's only possible in movies and comic books, and we love him for that. But at the same time, we have this scene with him talking to his father in the astral plane, and it's tragic and gut-wrenching, and so many black people empathize and know how this feels and understand why he has the reasoning he has for doing what he wants to do in this movie. He is definitely a hero of his own story, and if we're honest, he'd be the hero most of the black world would follow under the circumstances, if not for some other things that make this character so controversial. Just to remind those of you who didn't see this movie that grossed like $2 billion, Killmonger is the son of Wakandan royalty and was brought up as an orphan in the slums of Oakland, faced with the worst of what black people are faced with. He survived this by leaning into what seems to be his violent nature, then joined the military and was trained to be a weapon of the American imperial apparatus. Also hatched a plan to take over Wakanda and use their advanced military might to liberate black people all over the world, or at least that's what most of us hear when Killmonger expresses his intentions. However, what he actually says is that he wants to create a Wakandan empire. His plans aren't liberation, but domination. He even used the classic phrase used by Great Britain in the 19th century while they were on their global colonization quest, killing, oppressing, and enslaving millions in the process all over the world. The sun will never set on the Wakandan empire, except in reality, it was the British Empire. He also killed his black girlfriend for kind of no reason, and then choked another random black woman for kind of no reason other than intimidating people. And while it doesn't make no sense, it's hard to pair these actions with the character that we empathize with in the astral plane a few moments later, which is really smart script writing to do all that wild, crazy stuff before we actually get to know him as a character. But that same level of slickness is also problematic because the movie essentially employs white supremacist framings of black liberation and radicalism. Killmonger is trying to do the mythical white genocide, and like, how can you root for him under those circumstances? When you think about it too hard, which you should, it's pretty gross. Coogler made the mistake of making Killmonger make way too much sense and be way too understandable, so he had to force him to behave in more villainous ways to make his counterpart T'Challa, the hero, played by the late Chadwick Boseman, more appealing. And this is even more insidious considering the fact that in the comics, T'Challa, in attitude at least, not necessarily in the whole white genocide part, is much closer to Killmonger's general disposition than the passive, indecisive, reconciliatory figure he is in this movie. Coogler and I'd argue, more importantly, Disney knew that making Killmonger make too much sense under these circumstances would be a bit too challenging to white audiences, so they took him from being a black radical in the vein of Malcolm and Huey and pushed her over the line into being a caricature of Hoteps like Umar Johnson or Tariq Nasheed. And what that does is ultimately undermine and disrespect the legacy of actual black radical movements. Thus, every 6 months, a Killmonger was right argument erupts on black Twitter again, and I think is the CIA cooking us as usual. The usual factions that sparked this argument are both wrong. Killmonger was the villain, and his actions are wrong. And they are, in some ways, an accurate reflection of certain very minimal and very dumb aspects of black radical traditions that had long since splintered off and become a whole lot of gross things. I made a whole video about it. Please go watch it. Killmonger was a villain and he was wrong. His idea for creating a new empire, but black, is not based in actual black liberation ethos or Pan-Africanism, but a black hyper-capitalist neo-colonialism ethos that has been a problem in America and in Africa for a long time and to this day. However, they did dress him up in this imagery and rhetoric of real Pan-Africanism and black radical thought, along with giving him legitimate criticism of global white supremacy. The They allow him to touch on so many problems with the very concept of Wakanda, and they did make him inspiring in his willingness to fight back against the system that many of us have decided to give up fighting. But that's also the problem, because they made it seem like the type of people to want to fight back in the way that he does are also ridiculous, misogynist genociders. And that's just wrong, because you really responsibly shouldn't put those two things together into one character, and especially if you're gonna juxtapose that against the real hero of the story, T'Challa, who just comes off as a feckless aristocrat by comparison and ends the movie promising to give the most valuable mineral in the world to Western powers with a smile. A better version of Killmonger was possible. Like, you could do one of two things: either just make him fully a real Hotep based on the buffoonish actions of a Umar Johnson or Tariq Nasheed, and give him none of the real politics and show that he was always a shyster to begin with. That still would be problematic, but it would at least be following along a traditional line of actions around that type of archetype this whole time. Or, if you ask me, the best thing would have been to make Killmonger exactly how he is and remove all the bullshit from him. Just make him outright definitely correct in his behavior. Coogler should have made T'Challa and the audience grapple with the cognitive dissonance of being responsible for rooting for the defeat of a real Black liberation fighter by a Black king, unwittingly or purposely acting in service of a system that oppresses Black people all across the country. It's not like that hasn't happened in real life. The NOI and Louis Farrakhan were allegedly responsible for the death of Malcolm X, partly due to influence by the FBI. We know that Black CIA operatives infiltrated the Black Panthers and other Black radical organizations and caused the deaths of people like Fred Hampton and Bunchy Carter. This could have been a great opportunity to change T'Challa's character and make him go through something significant, especially since he was already on an arc of redefining himself once he lost his father and saw the folly of his ancestors. But that's just not what Coogler gave, and maybe he did and Disney said that he couldn't do it, which is why I think it was really important for him to have full power over what Sinners was about, especially that last scene, which I think is very much related to how he feels about what happened in the Black Panther movies.
Double kill. Ultra kill. Monster kill.
I can't expect a company like Disney to give the go-ahead on such a development. That type of complexity is a rare thing in mainstream media featuring Black characters. The bottom line is that if you want Black villains who you truly empathize with, you're probably not going to get them in media where white people are being heavily considered as part of the audience, which brings me to my next area that I want to talk about. We care about villains like Killmonger because he's written in a way to be empathized with, because we identify with so much of what he does. And even that part is important because those things give us a window into our own morality from an angle that would probably get us fired if we said it at our job. And while the arguments that happen on Twitter every 6 months about Killmonger are mostly silly, I'm sure at some point people are actually deepening their understanding of their own moral compass and politics and Black issues, which is still valuable in the long run. And that's what a well-written, empathetic villain does. It forces these types of conversations. The problem is that not all Black villains are written by Ryan Coogler. Some, if not most, are written by people with much less investment in the Black experience, and that can have very mixed results. And even others who are written by people who are technically invested in the Black experience are still not written with the amount of depth and nuance that we see in Killmonger. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is this whole other thing that we'll talk about next. Part 2, villains we hate. So while Killmonger represents a type of Black villain that pains us because despite his villainous nature, we hold him close, there are also Black villains and villains who are Black that are just really good at doing their job to make us hate them, even if they have somewhat interesting or sympathetic stories. Take, for example, Monique and Precious. So I want to say this first. I hate this movie. I don't take issue with those who appreciate it. This film's raw depiction of trauma and survival, especially for Black women, I know it hit a nerve. I remember teaching in a school with several Preciouses when this came out, and it was a big thing, but this is not what I would call entertainment. To each his own. Never watched it after the first time, never plan to do it again. And part of that was because of the revulsion I had toward Monique as Precious's mother, Mary. The one thing I'll say about this movie is that Monique deserved her Academy Award playing the character of Marianne, a complete monster of a mother who left me, and I'm sure others, feeling physically triggered by her behavior toward her child. I think what makes it work so well is that the character really seems to show no sense that they think they're doing wrong in their behavior. Like Monique played it completely straight. Unlike, say, in a Tyler Perry movie where these types of characters come off as comic book villains, Marianne comes off as if she feels like there's nothing wrong with her sexual, emotional, and physical abuse of her daughter and the cruelty and harm she exposes her to.
She made him go away.
So whose fault was it
It's
then?
this bitch's fault because she let my man have her and she didn't say nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't do nothing. So those things that she told you I did to her, who else was going to love me? Since you got your degree and you know every fucking thing.
Even when she is faced with consequences, she doesn't bother to even lie about what she's done for the most part. She justifies it. And I've been in the presence of these types of parents, and that's kind of how it is sometimes. It's a chilling performance. Like, I often wonder what Monique's been doing since this movie. If it's one of those situations where the role of a character just got too far into the actor that they've been finding difficulty shaking it from that point on. Now, understand, this type of person is real. It's a real type of abusive figure that exists in many places, impoverished Black neighborhoods and non-impoverished Black neighborhoods. And so, kind of like Killmonger, there's a way to empathize with it because we understand that Mary is the result of the inhumanity that she also probably experienced herself, but we still hate her for it because of the way the character comes off on screen. And it's another example of how a well-done villain is still a hero in their own mind while being hated by everyone who's observing their behavior. The show The Wire is another excellent example of this, as it manages to produce multiple bad guys, various levels of criminals and corrupt politicians, all with complex and endearing traits, but it feels like it has only one real villain, and that's Mario Stanfield. While all the various criminals involved in the Baltimore drug game are murderers and thieves, Marlo manages to erase any sense of endearment that those roles might have. Unlike other figures who play villainous criminal characters of a variety of types in that show, Marlo erases any sense of endearment that that type of performance might have. You aren't meant to empathize with him like Avon or Stringer Bell. You just kind of see him as this unleashed force of chaos and wickedness that even gets other characters in the show who've also done horrible things to look at him and feel like he's going too far.
Yo, I'm not snitching on none of my boys. Not my corner, and not no Barksdale people, or what's left of them. But Marlo, this nigga and his kind, man, they gotta fall. They got him.
And I also think it was genius to not have him die at the end of the show when all these other characters, both loved and hate, are killed. You're given this catharsis of sorts, but him not dying and then going right back to the corner and doing the same shit just feels frustrating. And like, that is, I think, a perfect way to have that type of character exist, where you as the audience don't get anything that you kind of desire. But at the same time, I also feel like his fate is more cruel because it's clear that this dude just wants to do hood rat shit with his friends, and not being able to do that the way he's been doing it is probably just going to drive him crazy until he becomes, you know, deacon at a local church or a Black Republican state representative in Baltimore. However, when I got to this section, I could only think of one character played by one of the most beloved Black actors of all time. But this character embodies so many things that Black people hate about the villains and bad guys in our world, that even though the movie he comes from has some issues, watching this man get what he deserves, it's top tier. And I'm talking about Samuel L. Jackson and Django Unchained.
Them motherfuckers ain't here to buy no mandingos. They wants that girl. Pull this nigga up on that name. Now when you get there, they gonna take away your name, give you a number and a sledgehammer, and say, get to work. Then they gonna hit you in the head with a hammer, throw your ass down the nigga.
Samuel Jackson has probably more than any other Black A-lister played a villain on way more occasions than others. The Kingsman, Unbreakable, Jumper, Lakeview Terrace. He's been a villain more than anyone else I can think of. Feel free to let me know in the comments if I'm forgetting somebody else. I don't know, maybe Morgan Freeman's been a villain more times than I realize. I just can't think about it. And this is also a rare situation where we have a Black character written by a white person. And although I'm sure Sam Jack did a lot to guide the creation of the character Steven in Django Unchained, the fact that this came from Quentin Tarantino of all people, maybe that combination particularly is what allows us to produce a character that was this hateful. Django Unchained has a lot of problems. Quentin Tarantino is like a million edgy white guys from his era and up to now that grew up idolizing black men in art and music and only seeing us through those vessels of consumption as opposed to actual human beings, which is why the black people in his movies always tend to have this like kind of gross otherworldly exploitation element to it. At times I get that as entertaining, but it's also like, somebody stop him please, Sam Jack. Get your boy. Because it's clear that Quentin Tarantino liking and engaging deeply with black art is more so about him affirming his unique edginess than to actually show a love for that art in the first place. He's not the only guy to do shit like that. You have people like Howard Stern, Lisa Lampanelli, Michael Rappaport, Sandra Bernhard, Madonna. You know, Madonna loves some niggas. And this is why all of those people, including Tarantino, have a real intense love affair with the N-word, with the hard ER, mind you. And this is why his black characters, while almost always interesting and entertaining and prominent in his work, feel like bizarre caricatures of what a white guy thinks a cool black character is. Regardless, whether it was a stroke of genius from Tarantino or Samuel Jackson's political inclinations, Stefan is a truly despicable character in a way that only works from a black standpoint. Stefan is a send-up of the classic black Uncle Tom character, very explicitly being designed to resemble the classic image of the Uncle Tom, to the point of having Jackson, who could have just worn a wig, also take on prosthetics. Before Uncle Tom became an insult for black conservatives and general sellouts, he was a character in the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, also written by a white person, in which Uncle Tom is kind of this proto-magical Negro figure. At least that's what I've heard. I've never read that shit. Has anyone ever actually read this shit? This is a book that is so well known, but I don't know anybody that's actually read the shit, because I mean, look at the cover of this motherfucker. Anyway, regardless, this character has long since been derided by black people for being unrealistically and embarrassingly gentle and forgiving. At least that's what I read on Wikipedia. Again, I ain't read this fucking book. Anyway, moving on. What I do know is that the concept of the Uncle Tom is an enduring trope in black culture, arguably possibly to the detriment, as we maybe put too much work and effort into identifying who is and who isn't an Uncle Tom or a sellout. Like, some people obviously are sellouts and it doesn't require a lot of argumentation, but I realize now that a lot of y'all don't know what a real sellout looks like, and sometimes that's frustrating. Anyway, Steven in this film is most definitely an easily identifiable sellout. His first scene is a mini clash of power between him and Django, with him clearly feeling threatened by the fact that Django was on a horse in the presence of all these white people. And for the rest of the film, Steven, for no real reason, seeks to undermine the plans and goals of Django. And in saying that, I don't mean there's no actual reason, it's more so that he has no plot-specific personal motivation to want to thwart the goals of Django reuniting with his wife, other than a hatred of other black people. It's about status and pride to him, not liking the fact that Django is free in a way that he isn't and wanting to defy this. And this is actually a very flawed vision of how this type of Uncle Tom character should exist. It works well enough for entertainment value, but I've always felt like this isn't really what Uncle Toms actually do. What makes Steven so good, ironically, is that he's actually much more wicked and evil than your typical or sellout. The Candace Owenses of the world, or the Blacks for Trump types, only have one or two real motivations. It's some combination of a deep self-hatred or a general hatred of black people, or recognizing that they can grift to races by being their token Negro. It's one or both of these things 100% of the time. Steven is a bit different in that I don't see any sense of self-hatred in him. What makes Steven interesting but inaccurate is that Steven is well aware of what he's doing. In fact, he recognizes he is the most intelligent person on the plantation. And in some ways, it is similar to grifting that people like Candace Owen, or maybe more accurately, Charleston White, do, in that he's playing his role to maintain a preferred position under white supremacy. But there is a greater level of cruelty involved and a greater sense of wickedness from Steven. What we see in him is a slave who is clearly smart enough to manipulate the white people around him to the point where he is in charge in many ways. To be in that position and not just use it for your own personal benefit, but to use it vindictively on other enslaved people, that's a different level of it's just plain evil. There's this great sense of hatred in Steven's eyes in that scene where they have Django tied upside down and he tells him that he spared him one cruel fate after another just so he could ensure the worst possible outcome for him. That he made sure that he wasn't killed and wasn't mutilated and all these things just so his body could wither away at a plantation where it's known to work their slaves to death. And it's implied that this is how he acts towards everyone in the house that's black. So the idea that a slave would so ruthlessly endorse the mistreatment of other black people, that's a different level than your typical Republican Like, those people in reality are never actually around other black people. They're always surrounded and immersed in white spaces. They want their special privileges. They want to be more loyal to their masters, but Steven takes it so much further, and that's why we hate him. And that's why we love that Django got to exact revenge for us in the film. While this is a very effective and memorable villain, it still does have limitations in depicting blackness with any sense of accuracy. In its own way, it kind of turns real life problems among black people into a farce closer to a Tyler Perry villain, even if it's good and memorable. But I don't think this was an accident on Tarantino's part. Tarantino wanted to do something provocative and hyper-violent, and the idea of a gunslinging ex-slave fits the bill, but upon inspection, there's also parts of it that seem intended to paradoxically have us not take the large white body count overly seriously, something that isn't isolated to this movie, and something that gets really interesting when we analyze it deeper. And to do that, we're gonna actually dive, for the first time on this channel's history, into the world of horror. Part 3, no reason to really fear the spooks. So in the world of horror, there's actually no shortage of black villains. There's no shortage of black horror, in fact. Aside from the fact that there's been a few really good black horror movies, there's a lot of hood classics like Bones, Blackula, and the legendary Tales from the Hood. These are all films that are created for a black audience first and foremost, and they focus on themes and images that may not necessarily be of interest to a non-white audience, but definitely will be easily recognizable to their black audience target. For instance, one of my new faves in the genre of black horror is The Blackening. The Blackening is a classic bottle slasher where all the action takes place in one night with a group of characters with varying connections to each other, allowing for the exploration of a multitude of themes around black identity. It manages to be pretty clever in how it plays with tropes around who is and isn't black and what that means. Allison is constantly challenged on her biracial identity. Dwayne addresses experiences of homophobia even when it comes from his black female friends. Shanika is presented as the ghetto big black woman, but it's her surprising ability to swim that kind of helps save the day, and so on. One of the more interesting things that I wish they had spent more time and energy on is the actual villain, though. The character Clifton being another version of the sellout character who is ostracized for anti-black tendencies and then chooses to act out on those. Clifton admits to voting for Trump and grew up in Vermont, is insecure about his black identity. And I will say again, historically, this is an inefficiency in community building, as the initial response to the Cliftons of the world is ostracism, and for good reason. I go into this in my Bamboozle video if you want to hear me talk about it more. Despite his sellout nature and bizarre appearance, Clifton is a black villain. It's even proven in a subtle beat toward the end of the movie where he is able to listen to the wordless conversations between other characters.
He's crazy, are you sure?
Yes, nigga, I'm sure.
You heard me, I choose myself.
Okay.
I refuse to play.
Wait, did you hear all of that?
Yes, motherfucker, I did. You done fucked up now.
And this is a special ability that the movie has shown that only black people possess, which is a subtle, dope commentary on the flaws of how we often police blackness on who and who isn't black, when everybody that has the experience is, even if it's not exactly the same. So at the end of the day, this was a mostly black cast doing mostly black horror slasher things, and oddly, aside from some big cameos from bigger black stars at the beginning of the film, no other black people died from this one. And this brings me to some interesting observations. Going back to Black Panther for just a brief moment, it in many ways is the exact opposite of Django Unchained, both good and bad. I don't remember if I said this earlier, but one thing that's always bothered me about that movie is that the Wakandans never get violent toward their oppressors or any white colonizers in 2 movies at this point, like barely done anything. There's one scene at the beginning of Black Panther 2 where the Dora Milaje take out a bunch of goons trying to steal vibranium. And then there's this nightclub scene in the first one, but most of their time and energy is spent fighting each other or other oppressed groups in this equation. And the only folks that actually kill in service of black liberation are the villains. I feel like Ryan Coogler was given rigid rules on such things, which is why, again, I think a lot about this last scene of Sinners.
Unstoppable. Rampage.
What I've noticed is that with many black villains, especially in horror or thriller films created by and for white people, the concept of a black villain being dangerous takes on some interesting paratextual meanings. Black villains in horror are allowed to kill, but only for specific reasons. And to talk about that, I want to talk about the most bizarre movie I watched for this video, Mom.
drink alone. Don't make me drink alone. Don't make me drink alone.
Which unbelievably has been green light for a sequel. I don't know if she's gonna come back as a Terminator or some shit. It is what it is. Please don't go watch it. In Ma, Octavia Spencer plays a titular character who befriends a group of poorly supervised white teenagers and shows herself pretty much instantly to be an obsessed, sociopathic weirdo in her behavior. Eventually, this results in a killing spree, all due to an experience of violation that she had as a teenager at the parents of said teenagers. That's not a horrible premise for a thriller, but the execution of it and the paratextual conversations that at least me as a black person had while watching it throws everything off. As a black man with strong opinions on the black experience, I cannot watch that movie and not think of how unlikely and weird the whole scenario is. There's always an expectation to suspend disbelief in media, but watching a large, older black woman force a young white man to disrobe in front of his friends at gunpoint in a small rural town, only for everyone to laugh it out as a joke? No, that's fucking stupid and weird, and that just completely took me out of it. I was already kinda out of the movie, but at this point I was like, okay, I'm definitely watching some white person's fantasy of how it must feel to be black around white people. Also, all these kids are too stupid to live. They're lucky they're alive at the end of the movie. Race is barely engaged with Ma, at least not from any standpoint where it makes any sense from a black perspective. I'd argue that if you replaced Octavia Spencer with, say, Melissa McCarthy, you don't have to change much in the film at all. There's two moments in the whole movie that really in any way engage with race, and both surround the character Daryl, played by Dante Brown. One moment where his friends send him out to try to convince an adult to buy liquor for them, which already frustrates me because like he should know better. Like if you're the one black friend amongst white friends, you shouldn't be the one to do the illegal shit first. Who raised this boy? And then at the end, Ma paints his face white to humiliate him at the climax of the movie, which is one of the many unintentionally hilarious things. I guess it's probably because she doesn't have an issue with his parents, but the rest of the teens are brutally tortured in some way. But all this dude had to deal with is walking around with a white face. Less traumatic, I guess, but far more embarrassing. These minor moments of racial commentary come off as incredibly hollow, as if written by a white person who doesn't understand what it's like to be the token black friend or to suffer racial and sexual violence the way that Ma did. The film flashes back numerous times to show how Ma came to be a sociopath, being somewhat of a loner and one of the few black people at her high school and wanted to be accepted. But it's implied that it's her awkward, quiet nature that sets her apart, not her blackness, which is unrealistic. She's not an outsider because she's black, it's because she's a nerd, which, no, that's not how that actually works. The type of bullying and violence she suffers is greatly without any racial overtones, which just isn't realistic. She is tricked into performing a sexual act with a boy that she thinks is another boy who she likes and is then publicly humiliated for this. Within the film, this violation is played purely as a cruel joke, and the fact that everyone involved with the joke is white carries no meaning within the story. However, pretty much anyone black watching this has to consider the history of sexual violence against black women in American society, especially in the types of communities that this story takes place on. For them to ignore this completely takes me out of the movie for like the third or fourth time once this happened. When Ma goes on her eventual rampage, first killing the girl who set her up, her boss, and then the men who tricked her, it's played just as general revenge and not retribution for racial violence. And this is actually really important, and I think it's a really interesting observation that I want to talk further about. But first, I want to give a better, more recent example. In the show Severance, the character Millicent transitions from being a villain who is black to a black villain between season 1 and season 2. In season 1, Millicent is unnerving with his kind of retro 90s, 80s look, his monotone and sometimes otherworldly manner of speaking with all the big words and whatnot. But for the most part, his blackness is incidental, and he could have been played by a bunch of different white character actors who can give off the exact same vibes. But in the second season, he levels up to a more prominent villain role, and they also begin to engage the fact that he is a black man, not just in corporate America, but also in a white quasi-religious cult. And suddenly we have a lot of subtle and not so subtle commentary on the unique challenges of those types of immersion experiences. He is given a position of power, but denied simple things to like legitimize his position in their hierarchy, such as having his title be formally acknowledged. He's given a sub-employee similar to the role he was in, but instead of actually actually having a professional, he gets a college intern who essentially spies on him on behalf of his administrators. He is tokenized with this weird, clueless black washing of their cult literature, which leaves him seemingly confused and frustrated. He tries to connect with the only other black person in the office, only to be rebuffed and ignored, which is often the most hurtful part of the corporate black experience. There's few things more frustrating than being one of a few black people in an office space and recognizing that you're probably the only one that has some sense about what's going on, so you're even more isolated than you feel like you should be. The most triggering thing for me was his performance review, where these nitpicky, weird problems are presented as reasons to discipline him and denigrate his work. The "you use too many big word things" was unintentionally infuriating. He does eventually stand up for himself, which was nice, but that's kind of it. And although I enjoyed his character and the show as a whole, I was deeply frustrated by where he ended up by the end. Despite having so many moments of being menacing and unnerving in the whole show, he ends up by the last episode as the only bad guy in a bad position, having kind of done nothing to pay off his menacing presence in the grand scheme of things. While so many other villain characters are pushing things into place and we're developing all this other stuff for the third season, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't know if I'm gonna watch it. It didn't really end all that great for me, partially because the villain that we spent the most time with, the only black man with a reason to have something interesting to do in his position, spent most of the last episode locked in a bathroom. So he became blacker in a meaningful and interesting way in the second season, where we see some of his motivations engage with his experience as a black man being tokenized by a corporate juggernaut. But at the same time, all of that is kind of just left to sit and pushed aside in the process.
Apologize for the word.
Devour feculence. It means eat shit.
Milicic is actually an example of another archetypal black villain that I think has been done a lot in white-oriented media, which is the black villain as the indomitable force of order or discipline. I think it plays on stereotypes of how black people are often seen as lazy and prone to chaos and dysfunction, and says, what if there was a black person so dedicated to order or a code or some type of discipline that they were willing to do anything to uphold it, and that made their very presence unnerving? Think Gustavo Fring, Amanda Waller, even Giancarlo Esposito's character in The Boys, or Sister Sage in The Boys as well. The High Evolutionary in Guardians 3, and Common in John Wick. Common being a very affable and charismatic rapper who's known for his charm, all of that is stripped away for him to become an assassin. This subversion of how black people are often presented in media as gestures and the exaggerated swag and the black characters that Quentin Tarantino loves to write, when you contrast that against the Milicics of the world and you've internalized certain norms and expectations about how black people are supposed to act, this is a very effective but problematic way of creating a villain. While I hate the endpoint of Milicic's villain arc, I also think he was probably his most unnerving when he was participating in the celebration at the end. It shows how easily he's able to vacillate from cold and calculated to a dancing buffoon. And it's really good until it's not. And it's similar to Ma, because although there's plenty of reason for her to take the issue she does within her particular backstory, the fact that they purposefully avoid the clear racial overtones that would have been present in that type of situation leaves a lot to be desired. They're trying to have a little bit of racial commentary there without going far enough to make their white viewers uncomfortable. When it comes to a lot of black villains, especially black villains operating in white spaces, which often happens in horror, they can be scary, but only the right type of scary. And nothing is more scary to white people than racial retribution. If you think about the slasher genre in particular, there's always this effort to have at least a few victims who have it coming, either because they're bad people themselves or commit some type of moral taboo or something. See the history of the final girl trope, or the fact that so many slashers start out with teenagers getting killed while they're having sex. And in some cases, a character might not have any real flaws to make their death more emotionally affecting, but you still see that constantly happening. But there's always a line, unless you're in one of those sick Terrifier films, of course. Them shits are, I have not, only on the kill count, not in real life with them shits. It's clear there's a line where the scares stop being entertaining and thrilling and just start being upsetting. And I think one line is having a black villain who gets racially motivated retribution. Not for overt acts of racism, but in response to the more benign and more common forms of racism, for structural racism, the type of racism that are far more common in real life. That would have been pretty normalized in the experience of Ma and Milicic. Nobody called Milicic the N-word directly, but his entire life and work environment is structured to make sure he knows that that's how he's meant to feel. What Milicic is experiencing are forms of racism that most of the white audience would also participate in and probably not care much about. Thus, there would be little textual separation between them and the prospective victims of the villain. It's nothing for a white audience to watch Django mow down a bunch of white people at the end of the movie. Same thing with Smoke from Sinners, because they don't see themselves in those characters. In their mind, in the way that we understand racism in this country, those characters are getting what they deserve for being racist. However, for Milicic, the racism that he experiences doesn't really get any retribution. And for Ma, the sexual violence that she experiences is bad, but it wasn't racist, so we're just gonna leave that part alone. But I think this is something that white Americans have feared pretty much since Jim Crow, that one day a charismatic figure, maybe someone like me, might gain a large and influential black following, maybe from starting a YouTube channel, and humbly play a congenial and safe elder to amass resources and nominal fame, all while building trust with everyone, using the platform to subtly disseminate pro-black media with hidden messages at a subtextual level, maybe in a way similar to how we saw in The Blackening, where only black people fully get the message. Waiting to hit 1 million subscribers, only to activate this large audience, unbeknownst to you all, for a great day of revolution and retribution on our oppressors and their descendants, for literal generations of conflict and strife, with the real fear not being that we could be capable of such things, but that if we were, we'd be more than justified for some get back due to everything we suffered in this country. And that deep down inside, you realize that if it happens, you deserve it. In fact, you deserve worse. Isn't that scary? Wouldn't that be scary, y'all? To sleep more peacefully at night, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment. And to all the white people on my Patreon, you are definitely off the purge list. In all seriousness, when I speak of having to cater to a white audience as a creator in Hollywood, this is what I mean. It's not just about having white characters in black stories, but having stories that won't be too upsetting to white sensibilities. Black media has plenty of stories where both the protagonist and the antagonist are black, or where the protagonist is black and the antagonist is white, and the core conflict is of a racial nature. However, the reverse rarely happens. When the villain is black and the hero is white, their blackness tends to be relatively immaterial to the conflict. And in isolation, there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, I'd rather not get weird waste play adjacent pieces of media made by white creators like Django Unchained, because they really go weird places with those stories similar to Ma. But it's something to notice, and it's something that can be corrected when the story comes back to people that actually understand and are concerned with black issues. For example, the cult classic Candyman is a story about a black man who was lynched for getting with a white woman. And I know y'all love this movie, and I get why, because it's a good movie and it's iconic and has an iconic villain, but I can't get over the fact that his motivation in this movie is still very much centered around getting with white women, even though that's what got him lynched in the first place. Instead, he spends his time terrorizing poor black people in the projects, not, getting his lick back for being tortured and lynched. It's no surprise that when the sequel came and it was done by black creators, it recentered the story to be about racial trauma under the police. And instead of the ending with this white savior moment where the woman brings the baby out and sacrifices herself to save this one black child, it ends with another good old massacre of white supremacists, this time in police uniforms.
Double kill.
I'm sure there's examples that refute this, probably in smaller, subtle ways. The only film I can think of that does somewhat subvert this is the film The Land of the Dead with the character Big Daddy, who does lead a diverse people's revolution of sorts against the unzombified. In this movie, the zombies kind of represent the underclass and the non-zombified represent the bourgeoisie. And by the end of the movie, we're meant to empathize with the zombies and see the aristocrats as the real villains. But even here, it's much less of a race thing and more of a class thing. They could have taken the character Big Dad and replaced Eugene Clark with like Ron Perlman and nothing would have changed. What I'm getting at here is that if the movie's meant to elicit horror for the sake of fun, then any type of actual, like, accurate racial commentary, which is rare in any film, to be real, is definitely not gonna happen there. If it's a movie that's greatly intended for white audiences, you are just more likely to see a villain who is black than a black villain. And either way, you're rarely gonna get strong commentary around race coming from that character. Part 5, villains we love to hate. All right, let's talk about Sinners for just a second. It's got its own video coming in the future, but I feel like it would be wrong not to give a little bit of it here, right? Specifically, I want to talk about Smoke and Stack for a brief moment, specifically Smoke. For all intents and purposes, Smoke and Stack are bad guys, alluding to things I said earlier. They're ex-military, they're criminals who spent time as goons for the Irish and Italian mob in Chicago. It's clear they pulled some type of heist on their way out of Chicago, as is indicated in the film. And they have a fearsome reputation back where they came from to be maybe the types of dudes you don't want to mess with. Smoke specifically seems to have no chill or empathy. He has to be convinced to take wooden nickels from some of the customers to enter the juke joint, and indicates that he isn't fully interested in serving the community as opposed to making sure he has a lucrative business. One of the funniest moments of Sinners is something that from a different perspective would be depicted as a horrifying act of cruelty. When Smoke arrives at Grace's shop to do business and he has the girl watch out for him in the car, he eventually has to fend off would-be thieves from taking their liquor. He manages to do so, but he then realizes that in order for him to maintain that fearsome reputation, he needs to send a message. So he shoots one of the assailants, a teenage boy, in the leg, knowing that the boy will go on to tell the story about how he got his limp because he tried to steal from the Smokestack twins. In many other contexts, this would have been a way to get us to hate a villain, but from the right perspective, it's a way to show someone as a badass. And Smoke very much is that, and we love him for it, even though what he does for large chunks of the film is bad. And this is because, villainy aside, Smoke is a badass, and we love a badass. This is a type of villain as well, someone so good at being bad that we enjoy their presence, and when they do finally lose, it's almost a glorious, bittersweet goodbye. These are villains so iconic and cool that they overshadow their heroes or get close to it. Again, I bring back Dr. Facilier from Princess and the Frog. Yes, that movie gave Disney its first black princess, but I think the most enduring thing from that film is Keith David in that character. Example of a villain so cool and charismatic that you missed him when he was gone. With villains we love to hate, unlike a Precious or a Steven, they have the capacity to be so enthralling that they take over any scene and become memorable in their own right apart from the hero. Hannibal Lecter, Loki, Billy the Butcher, Homelander. But when you combine that fictional villainy and badassery with good old exaggerated swag that we attach to black people and specifically black men, I think things have the capacity to go up a notch. And it just so happens that this type of villain tends to thrive in the crime drama or thriller genre. One great example is Mahershala Ali as Cottonmouth in the first half of Luke Cage's first season. Mahershala is easily the best thing that show really ever had. He ate every moment he was on screen. He was menacing and violent just in his posture. And when he died suddenly halfway through the season, it was hard to continue and the show never really regained that momentum. But I think Cottonmouth is really based on an archetype that developed over a decade earlier with Nino Brown in New Jack City. New Jack City is a hood classic from an era of black crime dramas and thrillers in the 90s that I do thoroughly miss because I feel like, well, I mean, there are movies like this that's still happening, but I don't know. It's better than all the new shit y'all watch now. Nino is instantly iconic and looks like black villains would look like for generations forward. He has tons of quotable lines and iconic moments, and who can forget this man's hair? I want to be clear that these guys aren't like Killmonger and that we don't really identify or root for them. They're not right in any like framework that we can think of. And they also aren't like Precious or Steven in that they act in ways that we would never aspire to or empathize with. And because they occupy that median space but do it with so much flair, we can't help but want to see what they'll do next. It's just a perfect combination of writing, direction, and performance with that black essence to create beautiful monsters. And my favorite example of this, and my favorite black villain of all time, somewhat controversially, and we'll explain why later, is Denzel Washington's character Alonzo Harris in Training Day.
You know I'm surgical with this bitch, Jake. How you want it, dog? Huh? Closed casket? You remember that fool in the wheelchair?
You think you can do this to me? You think you fucking with? I'm the police. I run shit here. You just live here.
If I was a dealer, you'd be dead by now, motherfucker. You turn shit down on the street, and the chief brings your wife a crisply folded flag. The fuck is wrong with you?
King Kong ain't got shit on me.
To fully appreciate the greatness of this role and this performance, you have to also understand the deep lore here with Denzel Washington. I've talked about Denzel before as like the first like modern black leading man of this era and probably of all time. If you think about what a black leading man is supposed to be and look like and perform, you're gonna think about Denzel Washington. Poitier is comparable to Denzel, but for reasons I've talked about before, it's not a perfect comparison, and Poitier has his own triumphs and maybe criticism that you can take against him. But Denzel, not so much. He played a multitude of roles even as he became a superstar. And while he wasn't running around like Channing Tatum being like a stripper or whatever, he also did something that Poitier did not, which is be both a leading man, but also sexual and like attractive and aspirational at the same time. Denzel didn't have to gyrate on screen. He had a walk that any woman over the age of 35, probably going on 40, will tell you is how they wish men walked in their lives. From the late 80s to the early 2000s, Washington held down the spot of black leading men in everything from Shakespeare adaptations to playing lawyers to angels, and of course, plenty of cops. Now, Denzel is a megastar and accomplished actor, but if you ask me, he actually doesn't have a ton of great range. To an extent, I always feel like Denzel is playing himself, playing a character. And that may sound harsh, but I think that's just something that happens to a lot of big movie stars. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Tom Hanks, Will Smith, Jamie Foxx, etc. In like 90% of their films, it feels like they're just playing themselves in a movie, right? However, as in the case of, say, Tom Hanks, it is possible for that type of movie star figure to get a role that allows them to show a level of range that will get them the acclaim and recognition that they deserve. And from my point of view, Denzel had done that multiple times before he won his Academy Award for Training Day. Malcolm X, Hurricane, He Got Game. He had a lot of opportunities where he should have been seen as worthy of an award and he didn't get it. And when that happened for Training Day, for the first time Denzel wasn't playing a hero, it on one level was galling for anyone that just looked objectively at the idea that Denzel Washington had to play a villain to win the Academy Award. However, if you see him in this role, it's kind of it is what it is. Like, two things can be true at once. I don't want to fully gloss over there, right? Awarding Denzel Washington for playing a crooked cop and not one of the most significant black political figures of all time sends a message that cannot be ignored. However, if you watch this movie, you have to acknowledge that as this character, Denzel ate every moment he had on screen. He was as good as any villain has been in any medium ever. Alonzo Harris is a crooked cop, but not in any deep or complex way. It's pretty clear that he's just a morally corrupt type of dude that got in trouble with the wrong people and tried to use his status as a cop to get himself out of trouble and wasn't worried about what it took to accomplish that goal. I kind of love this aspect of the character. Unlike other examples where you as the reader or viewer or player or whatever are grappling with the decisions and actions of a bad guy, here you're just watching a bad guy be really good at being bad. There's tons of scenes to talk about where this is evident. The most epic, of course, is his final monologue where he goes on a Kanye West style unhinged rant against everyone in the streets in the moment. This monologue is so classic that people have been repeating it for decades now, to the point where I don't know if everyone realizes that line, King Kong ain't got shit on me, comes from Denzel in this role. But to me, the most telling and deep act of villainy is toward the beginning. Up to this point, Alonzo has come off discomforting and intense, but not in a way that might be completely reprehensible, outside of being a cop in the first place, of course. Maybe he's just hazing rookie cop Jake, played by Ethan Hawke, or maybe something is really wrong. It's hard to say until we get a few more minutes into the film. In this scene, Jake sees something go down. Two drug addicts preparing to sexually assault a young girl. Jake jumps into action, hops out of a moving vehicle, and takes on the two addicts and apprehends them while Alonzo watches, calculating what he was witnessing for later decisions he would make. And when Alonzo, the senior officer, finally takes over the scene, he victim blames the young girl who was being attacked before letting her run off with minimal concern as to what she was dealing with, and then proceeds to brutalize the culprits in this situation. It's even implied that he low-key maybe castrates one of the assailants on spot. Now, much like in Sinners, this is one of those moments where the horror of what's happening can be played different ways by the director and the actor. However, we do get this close-up on the assailant's face as Denzel brutalizes him. And maybe you don't want to empathize with what would be a rapist in this sense, which is sensible, but you also can't help but notice that Alonzo isn't really concerned with the fact that this guy almost just raped a young girl. He just knows and loves the fact that he now has an opportunity to enact violence with impunity. No one ever comes to the defense of pedophiles and rapists for understandable reasons, as those are probably rightfully considered the worst possible things one can be. However, if you pay attention to the way we engage with those types of people in society, you'll notice this attracts a certain type of person who is looking for, I'll say, consequence-free victims to enact violence upon. Like in the past few years, there's this new trend of streamers setting up would-be pedophiles and confronting them in public and then assaulting them. And I feel like people aren't recognizing the really fucked up nature of some of these videos because their victims, the people they're doing this to, are sex offenders. So they kind of just like, this person is getting what they deserve. And there's a context where I understand that stance, but this is again one of those situations where two things can be true at once. These people could be creating justifiable retribution against sex offenders, but they also could clearly be themselves people pursuing dominance and power and violence against folks where they know they can get away with it. Behavior that is perfect for a crooked police officer or, a police officer in general, but I got other videos about that. Go watch those. And Jake, being the good cop he is, doesn't say shit. He just kind of goes to flow. This is who the police are, Again, other videos for that. The role of Alonzo Harris is a role that a lot of other actors could have played a million different ways, and it is in fact a role that wouldn't necessarily have to change much if a non-black actor played it, but they didn't get a non-black actor. In fact, they got the black actor of the moment, a man known for his on-screen presence and commanding attention just through a look in his voice. Him winning an award for this and not so many other things is problematic, but in reality, the fact that we had come to love and root for and trust Denzel in so many other previous roles, watching him shed a tear while being whipped in Glory, watching him fight for his life in The Hurricane and for his son's life in John Q. All of these moments have taught us as an audience how to engage with him on screen and to trust, believe in, and root for him. So to have all that stripped away, to see how easily he could be an ethically bankrupt villain who assaults and brutalizes people, doesn't care about victims, terrorizes black people, and kills his friends for personal gain, all with the exact same smile, the exact same walk, the exact same charisma. That's amazing. That's the amazing thing about this role that could only have happened with the villain, with an iconic black actor such as Denzel. Denzel Washington as Alonzo Harris is outright evil in this movie, and that's what makes the movie worth watching to this day. But despite how much I enjoy that character and I enjoy the experience of that film and aren't super bothered by the context through which how that was rewarded for Denzel, it still doesn't mean that there's not some shit to talk about with how black villainy can still be used to uphold certain messaging and structures in the ways in which we see and engage with race in this country. The idea for this video came from watching the most recent major role for Denzel, and maybe only the second time he's been an outright villain, in Gladiator 2. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to what he did in Training Day, but there's some things from this masterful performance that leave a extremely bad taste in my mouth. Similar to Killmonger earlier, Denzel's character in Gladiator 2 critiques the nature of Rome, its corruption, its slavery, its abuse of the people. And he speaks that he knows of Rome's awfulness firsthand, so he seeks to destroy it. He doesn't use the best means to do this, but he's completely correct about everything he wants to do. However, unlike with Killmonger, his goals and ideas are not given any overt sympathy by the plot. He mentions being a slave, but aside from putting on a great performance, we don't get any real reason to root for Denzel, even though anyone who knows anything about Rome knows that he's correct. Another major difference from Killmonger is that his foil is not black, nor are most of the other people in the story. So at the end of the day, we are rooting for a white society to defeat this singular black crusader against their social system. And we're supposed to, as an audience, not notice that kind of is a little icky. Listen, just a tad bit, right? This is one of those dangerous examples of race swapping where if you're not thinking hard enough about what's happening within the story, then the paratext, the things people take away from what they're seeing that you may not have thought about as the creator can do a whole lot of damage that you maybe were not intending. Because at the end of the movie, after Denzel Washington does plenty of heinous things, we still know he's correct. So when he's defeated and then the main character does this all lives matter speech at the end of the movie, it's just kind of shocking from my perspective. Here's this black man that's been abused by the society, much like Killmonger. And much like Killmonger, he hatches a devious, violent plan for retribution, maybe even liberation. Instead of the empathetic, conflicting feelings that we have at the end of Black Panther as Killmonger dies at sea, this main character from Gladiator 2 basically says, let's make Rome great again, and everybody cheers. And it's like, this was bad. We need to talk about this one. So yeah, shit like that gets on my nerves, but it also stirs my brain. It makes me talk my wife's ear off on the way home from a movie and then write 90-minute video essays about it in response. As problematic as Denzel's character was in this movie, he was no less compelling. The story did say something about race, whether it was on purpose or not, and whether you're aware of it or not, you are receiving this messaging. There's something haunting about watching Denzel Washington, of all people, sink into a river as a bunch of white people cheer. Like, whether on accident or not, they're telling you something with that. But that's why I wanted to make this video, as an exercise in examining the parts of our media that we are prone to gloss over or prone to just not recognize. As I stated earlier, villains give us a safe way to explore things that should be taboo, such as killing an evil, incompetent ruler and his idiot partner who are both running the nation into ruin. That's all from Gladiator. I'm not making any inferences to real life stuff, just Gladiator 2 there. It gives us ways to examine how certain racial and cultural scripts and messages, both good and bad, might sneak past our consciousness if we're not paying attention. And hopefully, for the sake of telling Black stories, or at least stories of Black characters, analysis like this can contribute to improving how that works. Because sadly, while there are plenty of great examples of Black cinema out there, Black media is very much cooked, but maybe that's something for a later date. That last take about Black media being cooked may feel hyperbolic, but just to kind of drive a point home that I've barely touched on, but will definitely touch on in the next video, let's once again look at my favorite scene from Sinners. You could be watching one of the best scenes in cinema history right now, but YouTube wouldn't let me show this scene without all the fun sound effects. So here I am telling you about my streaming service, Nebula. You may be saying, well, FD, I've seen the movie. I can rent it from Amazon or Blockbuster, for those who remember, right? Anyway, that's true, and it's not a big deal, but what if I told you that this video has been out on Nebula for like a month before it came out on YouTube? What if I told you I was working on a Sinners video that will probably be done in September, but won't make it to YouTube until Halloween? If you're still here watching all the way at the end and you're new, what you just watched is called a video essay, and video essays are kind of like mini independent documentaries made by smart creative folks like myself on a variety of topics. They tend to be media focused, but there's also lots of history videos, cultural analysis, politics, science. It's probably the best new formula for educational entertainment to come around the last decade or so. And if you enjoyed what I gave you here, but you're interested in more, including stuff you can't watch on YouTube, you might be interested in joining my streaming service, Nebula. Nebula is an independent streaming service made by creators like myself. At Nebula, we're able to make content without the draconian laws of YouTube that force me to put silly sound effects over images of Black liberatory violence in case I might get all my money snatched from the video for doing something like that. But Nebula is really more than that these days for those who are maybe coming back. It's also a place where creators like myself are making bigger and better independent media and even film. Some of it is simple and sweet, like my short video analyzing the opening to Boondocks. Some of it is in the form of full-length feature documentaries and docuseries like Tom Nicholas's documentary Boomers, or the series on Middle Eastern conflicts and real-life lore, or pretty much every video from Bobby Broccoli, which is like the most amazing stories about science that you didn't realize you wanted to hear, all ad-free, comment section free, without all the BS that YouTube provides. But the thing I really want to talk about is the short and independent films that we're creating. Narrative podcasts, drama series, and so much more currently in production. I guarantee you, if you made it this far in this video, then there's more that you'll appreciate on Nebula. If you sign up by following the link in the description or use the QR code on your screen, you'll be helping my channel specifically and helping me get a little more momentum for projects I'm working on, such as an expanded version of my short documentary on whiteness, which you can only see on Nebula, talking to white people and making that into something much bigger. Regardless, thank you so much for watching this long. Thank you so much to Nebula for sponsoring this video, and peace.